Welcome to the Arrive Podcast, the U.S. Immigration Law Podcast for Canadians. My name is Jeremy Richards, and along with fellow immigration attorney Christine Jurusik, today we will be talking about sponsorship. And what does sponsorship look like for an individual looking to work in the United States on a work visa? What is a visa sponsorship?
What does that mean when the employer has to sponsor you?
Yes, and the answer isn't as clear-cut as you think it would be. And we get this question all the time. This is probably one of the most common questions we get, especially from Canadians, because a TN visa is looked at a little bit differently than an H-1B visa or an L-1 visa. And the process through which you get it is different. So the question as to whether or not a TN visa is actually sponsorship or not comes up on a regular basis. So what is that? What is sponsorship? In general terms, sponsorship means that an employer in the United States is filing paperwork with U.S. immigration to request a visa on your behalf for you to work for them in the United States. It also could mean that they're sponsoring you for a green card. But there is an employer who is petitioning to have you receive a visa to work for them, to be authorized to perform work under a certain profession for them in the United States for a duration of time. In a lot of employers, when you apply for a job, it'll have the requirements when you apply. In one of in U.S. citizens, whoever's filling out those job applications, it asks you on there, what is your citizenship? It could also ask, are you authorized to work in the United States? Are you a lawful permanent resident? Do you have a work visa? Or do you require sponsorship? And some employers flat out say, we do not provide sponsorship to work in the United States. You have to either be a U.S. citizen or a U.S. permanent resident. And a lot of Canadians get confused because they're told that a TN visa isn't sponsorship, and I don't require sponsorship to work in the U.S. So when they're asked that question,
they say no.
They say no.
Right.
So is that the right answer or the wrong answer?
No. Is that, do you put no because it's not the same kind of sponsorship that other visas require?
Because you don't have to. So for example, an H-1B visa, that's probably the most common one that's used in these scenarios where an employee requires sponsorship from an employer. To get an H-1B visa, the employer actually has to file with the U.S. Department of Labor to make sure that the right wage is being paid to that employee. After they confirm the wage, then they have to file with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So they actually file a petition, and on the paperwork, it actually uses the word sponsor to sponsor that individual to come into the United States to work for them. So it's a formal process where they have to go through the Department of Labor and through U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to receive authorization from both agencies to then petition that person to come to work in the United States for them. Whereas a TN, or TN visa, TN status, the individual can show up to a port of entry, and if you look at the CBP requirements on their website, it says that all you need is an offer letter, which is pretty vague. It's a little more complex than just an offer letter. But you show up with an offer letter at a port of entry, they'll give you your visa, and you can come work in the United States. Is that sponsorship?
Good question. Is it sponsorship, Jeremy? I personally, when people ask me that question, well, do I need sponsorship? I explain to them what the obligation on the employer is. So technically speaking, in the formal sense of sponsorship under immigration law, it is sponsorship because they're asking for an immigration authority to allow you to come in and work and give you work authorization. But from the perspective of the employer, they may not consider that to be sponsorship. So you have
because
to
they're
really
not filing with the Department of Labor, you don't have to file with USCIS, they're just giving you a letter.
And that's what people say, well, they're just giving me a letter, so that's not really sponsorship, is it? Well, technically, yes, it is. So you should say yes to that requirement when you're seeking a job in the United States. Will you require sponsorship? Say yes. It may open the line of communication where you're able to say, well, I am eligible for a TN visa. And I'm not required to get an H-1B or another type of visa that's going to be more of an obligation on the employer.
There's no
than the TN.
lottery, there's no Department of
Right.
Labor, USCIS. Yeah. So I would say, I would agree. In a traditional sense of what we talk about as sponsorship for immigration, it's really not sponsorship because you don't have to go through the Department of Labor, you don't have to go through USCIS, but you can't self-petition or be self-employed for a TN visa. Therefore, you need a sponsor. So
Right.
you can't do it on your own. You have to have a US client or a US employer who attests to the job that you're going to be performing for them in the United States, that it's under one of the USMCA professions, and you have to take that to
Right,
the
and
board.
they're giving you something in writing. So it's not like you can just show up with the job offer that the employer gives you and not tell them you need a TN. And hope that you're going to process through the border without ever letting them know.
And that's one of the reasons why the border absolutely requires an original offer letter or support letter on company letterhead, ink, signed,
and addressed to them,
and addressed to
not
them.
addressed to you. So
Letting the border know that, hey, I know this person needs a work visa to come in
Correct.
the US.
yes, so that's the key point, is you do need to let that employer know that you do need sponsorship or an author or a letter addressed to the border officer
We call
asking
it
for.
support.
We do. We call
So
it
I
a
think
support
it's pretty
letter.
semantic, support, sponsor.
Yeah.
I don't know, it depends on whether you look at it, but you need a minimum a support letter, proof that this employer wants you in the US to perform this job for them.
Right, and it doesn't serve anybody's purpose if you don't lay that out for the employer early on in the process. The reason being is you could go through, first, second, third stage interviews and even get an immigration attorney on board, and if you don't tell them you need this and try to spring it on them at the last minute, oh, by the way, can you just sign this letter so I can go to the border and get my TN? A lot of times they'll back up, they'll backpedal, and they'll say, I'm sorry, we can't sign anything like this. This hasn't been vetted by our, immigration attorney or our legal team, so no, we're not proceeding with this. And we've seen that happen before with very eager, employees looking for work in the U.S. And the best thing to do if that job, requires, you need a TN support letter. If that employer is not going to do it, that's just not the right position for you. There's plenty of employers out there that are willing to sign off on those letters.
Absolutely. And in my calls with individuals seeking TN visas in the United States, I make it clear. Every call. I ask them, I say, is your employer aware of the fact that you need a TN visa to work in the US? Have you told them?
It's important.
Are they willing to sign a support letter on your behalf?
Right.
Because those offer letters that you get from an employer, and we know what
They're
the
going to
standard
be.
offer
It's
looks
going
like.
to be insufficient
It's
on
going to be
some
addressed
level.
to you.
Right.
It may not even. It doesn't typically they don't address the specific duties, start and end date.
Even worse, I feel like a
factors
lot of those offer letters contain information that isn't required to get your TN visa and may actually give the officer concern unnecessarily on a lot of
the title
levels.
on there.
Right, the title or even your benefits package can raise concerns from the officer that this position doesn't line up with the TN requirements. So you got to be really careful not only of that everything correct is in that letter, but all the things that don't need to be in there are not in there, because you don't want to distract the officer from the fact that this is a qualifying position.
Exactly. Yeah, I think a title is one of the biggest ones. You see all sorts of titles with companies. They call people whatever they want to call them, right? We could call our paralegals. It could be a paralegal. It could be a legal assistant. It could be an admin assistant. You can call these people whatever you want to call it.
I've seen a lawyer being called a shareholder. That was their title.
Or partner, right? Partner's a common one too.
But you see, partner at
Are
least
you
lines up
working
with
as
what
a
a lawyer
lawyer?
does.
Yeah, are you
But
working?
shareholder, that doesn't really give you any idea as to what's going on with this person's profession. So you got to be careful.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's why when we work with individuals seeking TN status in the U.S., we capture much more information than is listed on an offer letter. So if you were to go straight off of what CBP says on their website and just show up with an offer letter, most of the time you're going to be refused or denied. It could deny you, just like you said, because it has information in there that is inconsistent with any USMCA profession. Then they put that in your file, you're flagged. Good luck trying to change that because you've already applied under a certain category that you may or may not know you applied under because it was what
That
it
you
said
applied
on
as
the
a
offer letter.
shareholder.
A shareholder, or a vice president,
Right.
or a director.
Yeah, that's
So you have to be very careful.
definitely.
So the sponsorship question comes up all the time, and it's very, some employers are willing to work around it, but you have to disclose early on in your conversation with them as you're going through the application process that, hey, I'm Canadian, I'm handled differently than citizens of other countries because we have the USMCA. And under the USMCA, there are 63 professions. I mean, you don't have to go into this much detail, but there's 63 professions. Right. I'm a computer systems analyst, for example. A computer systems analyst can obtain a TN visa or TN status at a port of entry or pre-flight inspection. With only thing I need from you as an employer is a letter showing that you support me to do this. It's a little bit more complicated than an offer letter. It'll detail the duties of the position, it'll detail a start and end date, qualifications, and it'll be addressed specifically to the port of entry or to U.S. Department of Homeland Security, so that they know that you as the employer are aware that this individual requires work authorization to work in the United States. So, is it sponsorship? I think that's still up for debate.
I think we have two different positions on that. That I technically think that it is sponsorship, but it's a different level of sponsorship than other types of visas require. And I think when you came back, you said that you didn't think it was sponsorship. So it's open for interpretation.
It's not your traditional
right.
immigration sponsorship, but in the end, yes. And this goes back to what was mentioned earlier, self-employment. You cannot be self-employed on a TN visa.
Right.
So if you look at it
so
from,
you can't self-sponsor. You can't
yes.
say I'm sponsoring myself for a TN visa, or I have a company and I want to sponsor myself. Nope, that doesn't work.
If you have a company in Canada, you can get a TN visa as long as you get it through a contract you have with a U.S. client. So who's sponsoring you in the end? Well, it's not your Canadian company. It's not you either. It's the U.S. client. Or if you have an offer from, XYZ Corporation, they have to sponsor you to get that visa. You can't get it yourself. And the way I often explain this to people is they don't issue visas for companies. They can't issue a visa for a company. A visa has to be attached to an individual. And and on top of that, that visa that's attached to the individual is then attached to an entity where they're going to be performing those services. Correct. So you have to have all those pieces in order to be approved for that visa. And if you look at it from that perspective, well, then there's somebody sponsoring you. Somebody's putting something out there in support of you for you to be able to obtain that visa.
So bottom line, should you say yes to the question?
If I were applying for a job and the employer asked that, I would say yes.
I agree. You should say yes.
And if there's room provided for you to explain it, maybe in your cover letter when you apply for the job, you can explain it. I put yes, I require sponsorship, but I'm Canadian, and this is what that means.
Yeah, I think a lot of people put no because they think it's going to kick them out of and it might.
And it might. And I see people do that, and then their strategy is they get far enough along in the process that the potential employer really likes them, and then they spring it on. So that's another strategy, and people do it, and it works. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that because I don't think you're being forthright in the application process, and a lot of employers could look
if it's an automated process,
and it
automatically kicks you out, you might want to say no, so that at least you can open the conversation later if you make it to the interview process.
And I think we've both had plenty of experience in this area where we're working with somebody and we've gone through the entire process, we've drafted the application, the support letter's ready to go, we forward that support letter on to
And
HR.
no matter how many times you've asked them, your employer's on board with this, right? You've addressed this with your employer, because sometimes we don't speak with the employer at all.
A lot of
Sometimes
times we don't.
we speak directly with the applicant, and they're handling the process, which is totally fine. That's completely acceptable. But you know, they're the go-between between us and the employer. And sometimes it gets to a point where we've prepared everything, and we think everything's ready to go, and then the employer backs out at the last minute and says, "Oh, I can't sign this. I just sent this to our legal team, and they won't let us approve this. We don't do sponsorship," and that's the end of the story. And legal fees are lost, and opportunities are lost as well.
Yeah, and sometimes they present it and they weren't aware of it, and they say, "Well, let us look into it." We have a call with them. We explain the process, and they're
That's
fine
true.
with it.
Yeah, we have had
And
a
they
lot
move forward.
of opportunities where we get to speak directly to the employer, and we're open to doing that if it helps our client move their case forward.
Yeah, so be careful when you're applying for jobs in the U.S. And we talked mainly about TN status here. This also applies to other statuses in the U.S. If you're applying for an H-1B, it's sponsorship. If you're applying for an L-1 visa, even if you're the owner of the company, guess who's sponsoring you? Your company's sponsoring you. So these, even in other types of visas, you can self-sponsor. There are some that do allow self-sponsorship, but they're few.
Those would be more of the self-employed type positions. So if you own a business in the United States.
Extraordinary ability individuals,
Right,
but also
yeah.
E1 visas. Those are often self-employed individuals.
True.
We have E1 clients, and that's an individual who trades in goods or services in the United States. Those individuals are often self-employed too. An E2 visa for investors, a lot of them are self-employed. They own the company. It's they're the sponsor. But in these work visa scenarios, these typical work visas where you're working for a company, those ones are sponsorship through an employer. And the level of sponsorship changes depending on the visa type. Where H-1B would have the highest level of sponsorship, the highest level of involvement from an employer,
Yeah, so I don't consider,
to the lowest.
the way I think of it, sponsorship is sponsorship, right? They have to sign off and say that they're going to employ you. And that's across the board with any visas, but the obligation on the employer is different.
That's a good way to put it.
You know, what's required of the employer is different based on the different type of visas. So even though it is sponsorship, it's a very low level of requirement on the part of the employer. It's signing a letter, where H-1B is much more involved.
Yes, absolutely. So, in speaking to Canadians, you know, if you are seeking to work in the United States and you know you qualify for a TN under the USMCA, disclose it as early as you can in the conversation. Let them be aware of what the situation is, and you'll be surprised once they understand the process. And in that process, we've talked to employers from the beginning. They say, "Hey, I have this offer, but they don't understand what a TN is and how it works. Can you talk to them?"
Yeah.
Sure, we'll have a quick conversation, explain it to
Or
them.
email exchange, even sometimes it's just a quick email and the employer understands and everybody's on the same page.
Oh, I don't have to work with the Department of Labor. Oh, I don't have to pay all those H-1B filing fees.
Yeah.
Wait, I don't have to pay anything if I don't want?
Yeah.
No, you just need to sign a letter. Oh, okay. Yeah, we'll do that. So, yeah, you'd be surprised about how many employers are willing to sponsor because of the ease of the process compared to other sponsorship. And that's, I think, where employers get intimidated. They hear sponsorship and they think Department of Labor, all the filing fees and everything you have to do.
And that's the purpose of the USMCA is to allow Canadians, Americans, and Mexicans in those professions to work freely in each other's countries. So the same benefit goes the other way for Americans. They can come and work in Canada in any of those professions with the same limited obligation on the employer. And that's why it was called the Free Trade Agreement, now the USMCA, because it's a free exchange of trade between these three countries. So that's why it's an easy process. And employers, once you explain that to them, they understand, and most of them get on board with it.
With the correct paperwork presented at a port of entry or pre-flight inspection area within 30 minutes to an hour, you're admitted to the U.S. on your visa status, and you're able to start working. It's that simple. Well, thank you for tuning in today to the Arrive Podcast. If you haven't already, you can subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Give us a thumbs up so other people out there can find us as well. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.